It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in Oakwood, a charming suburban neighborhood where life moved at a slow and easy pace. The kind of place where every house had a neatly manicured lawn, where kids played in the streets after school, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries as they walked their dogs. The sky was a perfect shade of blue, the kind that suggested no trouble could possibly be brewing beneath its surface. As the breeze rustled the leaves of the tall oak trees lining the streets and the soft hum of lawnmowers filled the air, it seemed like an ideal afternoon for the Thompson family to relax. Sarah Thompson, the youngest of the Thompson family, was in the kitchen, helping her mother Lisa prepare lunch. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the house, mixing with the aroma of her mother's famous vegetable stew simmering on the stove. Sarah loved these moments. It was just the four of them, her mom, her dad, Mike, and Grandpa Tom, spending time together in their home of over 15 years. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door, a single, firm rap that echoed through the still air. She glanced at her mom, who gave her a small nod as if to say, "Go see who it is." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and made her way toward the front door, wondering who would be calling at this hour. She opened the door to find a man standing on the front porch, holding a clipboard in one hand. He wore a dark blue uniform, with the insignia of the Homeowners Association, HOA, on his chest. His face was stern, his features sharp and purposeful, as if he had a mission to complete. His eyes scanned her for a moment, then landed on the small placard near the door that read, "Thompson Residence." "Good afternoon, miss," he said, his voice brisk and polite, but carrying an undertone of authority. "I'm Officer James Mitchell, with the Oakwood Homeowners Association. I'm here to conduct an inspection of your property line." Sarah blinked, slightly taken aback by the sudden intrusion. The HOA had sent letters before about small issues here and there, but she hadn't expected anyone to show up unannounced. Still, she did her best to be polite. "Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously, her mind racing with a million thoughts. Was something wrong with the fence again? Had they missed something? "Everything's fine," Officer Mitchell assured her, though his expression remained serious. "It's just a routine inspection. We've received a few complaints about the height of the fence at the back of the property, so I'm here to make sure everything's in compliance with the HOA guidelines." Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew exactly which fence the officer was talking about, the tall wooden fence that Grandpa Tom had put up years ago. It was a sturdy structure, designed to give the family some privacy and shield them from the neighbors' constant prying eyes, but it was also taller than what the HOA typically allowed. Grandpa had always said it was for their peace of mind, and the family had lived with it, despite a few warnings from the HOA. "Oh, that fence," Sarah said, forcing a smile. She knew her father, Mike, had been trying to work things out with the HOA over the past few months. They had submitted several requests for adjustments, trying to meet the guidelines without sacrificing too much of the fence's height. But clearly, it hadn't been enough. "I'll just be a few minutes," Officer Mitchell said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced around. "I need to inspect the rear fence and make sure everything checks out. Could you point me in the right direction?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the backyard. She glanced over her shoulder to her mother, who had come to the doorway to see who it was. Her mother's face was a mixture of curiosity and concern, but she didn't speak. Sarah turned back to Officer Mitchell and nodded. "I'll show you," she said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the side gate. Officer Mitchell nodded in acknowledgement, and without waiting for another word, he proceeded toward the back of the house. Sarah followed him, feeling a sense of unease settle in her chest. She wasn't sure why the officer seemed so determined or why the HOA had taken such a hard stance on the fence. It wasn't as if they had ignored the rules. After all, they had worked with the HOA for years. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized the HOA was rarely known for being lenient. As they walked past the garden and toward the gate, Sarah's mind wandered back to the previous week when the HOA had sent another sternly worded letter. It had stated that the fence, which stood tall at 7 feet in some places, was still in violation of the community's rules, despite the adjustments her family had made to reduce its height by a foot. But the fence still wasn't short enough to satisfy the HOA's guidelines. It had become a point of tension between the family and the association, and now the HOA had decided to send an officer to check up on them in person. "Here it is," Sarah said, pushing open the side gate. She watched Officer Mitchell step onto the backyard patio and look around with a clinical, almost detached gaze. The fence, standing tall and proud, loomed behind her family's flower garden, cutting off the view of the neighboring property. Sarah could see the officer take a step back, measuring the height with his eyes, his lips pressed into a thin line, as he made some quick notes on his clipboard. "Everything seems to be in order," he muttered to himself, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had a nagging sense that the officer wasn't just here for an inspection. "I'm just going to measure the fence for a moment," Officer Mitchell said, taking a small measuring tape out of his pocket and stepping closer to the fence. As he measured the height at various spots along the structure, Sarah stood by, her arms crossed, her mind racing. Was this really just a routine inspection, or was there more to it? She had never seen an HOA officer quite like him before. Most had been polite and professional, but Officer Mitchell seemed different. He wasn't just here to check the height of the fence, he was here to enforce something. His presence felt almost invasive, and Sarah could feel the tension building between them, even if the officer remained calm and professional. As Officer Mitchell worked, Sarah turned to head back inside. Her mother had retreated into the kitchen, likely preparing lunch. Sarah's footsteps were slow, her thoughts a million miles away, and she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. This visit, this inspection, wasn't just about a fence. It was about something much larger, the HOA's increasing control over their lives, their property, and their rights as homeowners. Before she could reach the door, she heard a sharp noise from the backyard, a metallic clang. It was followed by a muffled curse. Sarah turned around, her heart skipping a beat. She saw the officer standing at the base of the fence, looking a little startled. "What happened?" Sarah asked, taking a step toward him. "I'm fine," Officer Mitchell replied, his voice slightly shaky. "Just checking something on the top of the fence. Looks like I'll need to climb over to get a better look." "Climb over?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "You can't just—" Before she could finish her sentence, the officer had already started to climb. He wasn't being careful or cautious. It was almost as though he was in a hurry. Sarah watched in disbelief as the officer scrambled up the fence with little regard for the fact that it was private property. The top of the fence wasn't exactly stable, and the officer's quick ascent seemed almost reckless. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. She glanced back toward the house, hoping for guidance from her parents, but there was no time. The officer was already on top of the fence, standing there with one hand gripping the wooden posts and the other holding onto his clipboard as if it were an afterthought. That's when it happened. Mike Thompson watched in stunned silence as Officer Mitchell approached the fence, clipboard in hand. He could see the officer's every step, the way his polished shoes made a soft clack against the stone pathway leading to the backyard. His heart began to race, and his pulse quickened in that way it did whenever something unsettling was about to happen. It was as if his brain was telling him this was all wrong, that the situation was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. Sarah, standing beside him in the kitchen, peered out the window as well. "Is he really going to do this?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Mike didn't answer immediately. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. The HOA had made their position clear about the fence. Mike had received countless letters, each more insistent than the last, each with a new rule or regulation they had somehow missed. But there was no rule in the book that allowed an officer to simply climb over someone's fence without permission. That was, in Mike's mind, crossing a line. The fence, after all, wasn't just any fence. It was a monument to his father, Grandpa Tom, who had built it years ago when Mike was still a boy. Grandpa had designed it with care, using sturdy cedar, wood, and ensuring that it was both tall and durable enough to keep out prying eyes. It stood well above the HOA's prescribed height limit, but that wasn't by accident. Grandpa had always insisted that privacy was a right, not a privilege. And the fence, with its rich reddish-brown hue, had become a symbol of that belief. Mike's mind wandered back to the early days when Grandpa Tom had started constructing the fence. At the time, the neighborhood had been expanding rapidly, new houses sprouting like mushrooms after a rainstorm. People had moved in with their families, bringing their own rules and ideas of what was proper for the neighborhood. The HOA had become more insistent on enforcing its codes, but Grandpa had refused to bend. The fence was his way of saying, "This is my land, and I'll do with it what I please." But that rebellious spirit, the very spirit that had led to the fence's creation, was now being tested in a way that Mike had never expected. Officer Mitchell, now standing just a few feet from the fence, was eyeing it with an almost clinical detachment, as though he were inspecting a piece of property for sale rather than a private home. "Dad's gonna lose it," Mike muttered under his breath, watching the officer's every movement with growing concern. He knew his father well, knew that Grandpa Tom wasn't a man who tolerated disrespect for his property. As if on cue, Mike saw Grandpa Tom, who had been sitting on the front porch in his usual rocking chair, slowly rise to his feet. The old man's face was creased with a mix of irritation and something darker, a quiet fury that Mike recognized immediately. "What's he doing?" Sarah asked, her voice now tinged with worry. She had seen her grandfather angry before, but this seemed different. This wasn't just irritation. This was something deeper, more intense. "I think he's had enough," Mike said, his voice tight. The officer, still holding his clipboard, approached the fence with methodical steps. Mike watched, his eyes locked on the officer's hands as they gripped the top of the fence. Then, to Mike's disbelief, the officer didn't simply measure it as he had been doing earlier. No, he made the decision to climb it. With a grunt of exertion, Officer Mitchell placed one hand on the top of the fence, his fingers curling around the edge of the rough wood. His boots scraped against the wooden planks as he tried to find his footing. Mike's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe it. This was beyond anything he had imagined. The officer was scaling their fence, without asking for permission, without any hesitation, and certainly without any thought to how this might appear. Sarah's eyes widened. "He's actually doing it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike couldn't believe his eyes. "Is he serious?" he muttered, almost to himself. He watched as the officer continued to climb, one hand after the other, his feet pressing against the fence as though it were an everyday task. The sight was absurd. This man, who was supposed to be representing authority, was now trespassing, violating not only their personal space, but the boundaries of common decency. Mike's blood began to boil. The idea of climbing the fence was something entirely different from measuring it or inspecting it from the ground. It was an intrusion, an invasion of their home, their property, their privacy. And yet there the officer was, nonchalantly making his way to the top. Mike's eyes flickered over to Grandpa Tom. The old man was standing motionless on the porch now, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Mike could see the tension in his father's posture. Grandpa was holding something back, something big. "Why does he have to climb it?" Mike asked, his frustration starting to get the better of him. "It's not like we didn't say we'd fix it," but Sarah only shook her head. "It's not about the fence anymore. He's just being rude." Mike glanced back out the window, his heart pounding. The officer was halfway up now, his back to them as he scrambled over the top. Mike had had enough. This wasn't just a minor infraction. This was an act of disrespect. It was at that moment that Grandpa Tom, with a deliberate slow movement, stood up from his rocking chair. His old creaky knees seemed to protest the effort, but Grandpa didn't seem to care. He was a man of action, a man of resolve, and today he was going to act. "I've had enough of this nonsense," Grandpa muttered under his breath as he made his way toward the side door. Mike turned to look at him, his expression filled with both concern and a bit of amusement. "Dad, you don't have to do anything." "Let's just talk to him," Mike said, trying to reason with his father. He didn't want things to escalate, but Grandpa didn't seem to be listening. "No," Grandpa said, his voice hard and final. "I've let them push me around for too long. This is my property, and no one climbs my fence without consequences." Mike opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Grandpa had already disappeared into the garage. Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance, their confusion palpable. What was Grandpa going to do? Within moments, the answer became clear. The garage door creaked open and Grandpa emerged, carrying a large box of tools. Mike's stomach sank. He knew exactly what was coming next. Grandpa Tom wasn't just going to fix the fence. No, Grandpa had his own way of solving problems, his own way of dealing with things that annoyed him. The box was full of the electrical, tools and equipment Grandpa had used for years in his work as an electrician. He wasn't just going to repair the fence. He was going to make sure that anyone who dared to climb it again would think twice. Mike's eyes widened. "No, Dad, you can't. Please don't do it." But it was too late. Grandpa was already making his way toward the backyard, his face set in grim determination. Mike and Sarah rushed to the door to follow him. By the time they reached the backyard, Grandpa was already pulling out wires, a small voltage regulator, and some other electrical equipment. Mike's mouth went dry. He knew what was happening now. Grandpa was going to electrify the fence. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, but it was too late. Grandpa was already at work, attaching wires to the top of the fence. Mike felt a sense of dread wash over him as he watched his father work with a calm, methodical precision. "Dad, you don't have to do this," Mike pleaded, but Grandpa was too far gone in his determination to listen. He was already hooking up the electrical system, making sure it was set at a low voltage, a harmless shock, just enough to send a jolt through anyone who tried to climb over again. Mike stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. This wasn't how he imagined things going. But then again, this was Grandpa Tom, a man who didn't take kindly to being pushed around. The fence had always been a symbol of Grandpa's defiance, and now the old man was about to make sure no one would ever dare to cross it again. As Grandpa finished setting up the electrical system, he stepped back and surveyed his work with a satisfied nod. "That should do it," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. "Let's see how our friend likes it." Mike turned to Sarah, who was wide-eyed and speechless. There was nothing to say. Grandpa had made his point. Now, they just had to wait and see what happened next. Grandpa Tom's hands trembled with a mix of excitement and anticipation as he made his way to the garage. The old wooden floorboards creaked under his feet, each step filled with the weight of his years. But there was a purpose in his movements. He wasn't the spry young man he once was, but today he was determined to make his point. He had tolerated the HOA's meddling for long enough. Their rules, their inspections, their constant need to dictate how he should live his life. It had all gone too far. And now it was time to send a message, one that no one in Oakwood would soon forget. Mike and Sarah exchanged puzzled glances as they watched their grandfather walk to the garage. They knew he was capable of strange things, but they had never seen him this focused, this determined. The curiosity that had bubbled up in them since the moment Officer Mitchell had begun his climb over the fence only deepened now. What was Grandpa up to? And why did they have the distinct feeling that things were about to escalate? "I hope he's not thinking of anything too extreme," Mike murmured, though he already knew that when it came to Grandpa, extremes weren't. Just likely. They were almost guaranteed. Sarah, who had been staring out the window at the officer who was still inspecting the property, looked back at her father. "Do you think he's really going to do something?" Mike didn't have an answer, but the tense look on Grandpa's face as he disappeared into the garage only fueled his concern. A few minutes passed in near silence, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, without warning, Grandpa Tom appeared again, carrying a heavy old wooden box in his hands. It was a box that over the years had been filled with tools, parts, and gadgets from Grandpa's days as an electrician. He had worked with wires and electrical systems for decades before retiring, and even now those skills remained sharp. He had built, fixed, and repaired things for the family for as long as anyone could remember. But today was different. Today, he wasn't fixing a light bulb or installing a new socket. Today, he was preparing to send a message. Grandpa's grin, though small, was mischievous, his eyes twinkling with something darker than amusement. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity, to show the world what it meant to mess with his property. "I've had this idea for years," Grandpa said, his voice full of the same playful defiance that had made him a legend in Oakwood. "If that officer wants to scale my fence, he's going to feel it." Mike's heart sank as he watched Grandpa carry the box of electrical supplies toward the fence. "Dad, no, you can't be serious." But Grandpa only chuckled and raised an eyebrow. "Don't worry, Mike, it'll be fine. Just a little jolt. Nothing too serious." Sarah looked horrified. "You're going to electrify the fence?" Grandpa just shrugged. "Sometimes you have to give people a little reminder about respecting boundaries." Mike opened his mouth to protest, but before he could get another word in, Grandpa was already pulling out the wires, the transformer, and a voltage regulator. He worked with the precision and ease of someone who had done this kind of thing hundreds of times before. He wasn't just hooking up wires, he was setting up an electrical system that would send a shock, not enough to seriously harm anyone, but enough to make them think twice about crossing the line. As Grandpa worked, the sounds of the backyard seemed to fade into the background. The only thing Mike could focus on was the image of his father at his age, still carrying out such an elaborate plan. Grandpa had always been a man of action, a man who believed in taking matters into his own hands. Mike could only imagine how the HOA officer would react when he encountered Grandpa's solution. The officer, who had finished climbing the fence, was now inspecting the yard. He had no idea what was happening just behind him. He wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary. To him, it was just another inspection. He didn't know he was walking into a trap, one that would leave him with more than just a few notes on his clipboard. By the time Grandpa finished wiring the system, everything was set. The fence had been rigged with a low-voltage electric system. If someone tried to scale it, they would feel a harmless jolt, a sudden surprising shock, enough to make them reconsider their actions. Grandpa had ensured that the voltage wasn't enough to cause any real harm, but it was certainly enough to send a clear message. "There," Grandpa muttered, stepping back to admire his work. He wiped his hands on his pants and surveyed the fence. "That should do it. Let's see if our friend enjoys his little surprise." Mike and Sarah exchanged nervous looks. Neither of them was sure whether to laugh or be scared. Grandpa wasn't just old-fashioned, he was downright rebellious, and he had just set up a scenario where someone was going to get a very unpleasant shock. Grandpa, looking satisfied with his work, walked back to the porch and sat down in his old rocking chair. He gave a small grunt of contentment as he settled into place, his eyes fixed on the officer, who was still moving around the yard. Mike and Sarah joined him on the porch, watching the scene unfold from a safe distance. For a few moments, nothing seemed to change. The officer continued his inspection, unaware that he was about to walk into something he wasn't prepared for. But then, as the officer approached the top of the fence again, it happened. A loud yelp pierced the air, followed by a startled shout of, "Ow!" The officer jumped back, his hands instinctively reaching for his arm as if he had been burned. He looked at the fence, his confusion evident. His eyes narrowed, scanning the wooden slats, trying to figure out what had just happened. He took another step back, staring at the top of the fence as if expecting something to appear. Grandpa's chuckle echoed across the yard, and Mike couldn't help but laugh himself, though he couldn't entirely hide the unease that still gripped him. "Guess that'll teach him not to climb my fence," Grandpa muttered under his breath. The officer, clearly rattled, quickly climbed down from the fence and backed away. His clipboard had been forgotten on the ground, and he muttered something unintelligible under his breath. He had no words to say, no explanations to offer. His actions spoke louder than anything else. He was done. The message had been received. With a final glance at the Thompsons' property, the officer turned and walked briskly toward the gate. His footsteps were hurried, his face flushed with frustration and confusion. Whatever authority he had come in with had been entirely deflated by the sudden shock. He wasn't going to challenge Grandpa Tom. Not after that. Mike, still in disbelief, stood up and walked toward his father. "Dad," he said, shaking his head, "you actually electrified the fence?" Grandpa, who was sitting comfortably in his chair, looked up at him with an innocent expression. "What? It wasn't dangerous. Just a little zap, a little reminder that people should respect other people's boundaries." Mike rubbed his temples in frustration, but deep down, he couldn't help but admire his father's boldness. "You can't just go shocking people, Dad. That's insane." Grandpa waved a dismissive hand. "Well, it worked, didn't it?" "Yeah," Mike admitted reluctantly. "It definitely worked." For the rest of the day, things returned to their usual routine. The sun set slowly behind the trees, and the Thompsons spent their evening in relative peace, the incident with the HOA officer slowly fading into the background. As far as they were concerned, the message had been sent loud and clear. The officer, for his part, never returned to the Thompson property. The neighborhood soon found out about the shocking turn of events, and rumors began to spread. Word of Grandpa Tom's electric fence solution traveled fast, and before long, the HOA knew they had been bested. They never sent an officer to inspect the Thompson property again. From that day forward, Grandpa's fence became more than just a barrier. It became a symbol of defiance, a reminder to the entire neighborhood that sometimes the most creative solutions came from the most unexpected places. And as for the HOA, they learned that they could push people only so far before they, too, would feel the shock of standing on the wrong side of a boundary. The Thompson family never heard from Officer Mitchell again, and Oakwood returned to its peaceful rhythm. But whenever anyone asked about the infamous fence, Grandpa Tom would simply smile, lean back in his rocking chair, and say, "Sometimes you have to shock people into learning respect." For more unforgettable tales like this, subscribe to the HOA Stories and stay tuned for the next wild adventure.